Hi, everyone. It's me, Krylios, Team Racing Productions MC and producer. And joining me today is Eric Marcus. Welcome.
Thank you for having me on your show today.
Certainly a pleasure, Eric. How are you?
I'm good. It's sunny in New York, and as long as I don't read the news out of Ukraine for 5 minutes, I'm okay.
That
Uh,
is true. That is true. Well, it is great to have you here. I want to start this off with just having you introduce yourself to our audience and let us know a little bit about your background.
so I am Eric Marcus. I'm the founder and host of the Making Gay History podcast. I was born and raised in Queens, New York. Uh, Went to public schools, planned on being an architect, and wound up being a writer instead. I'm the author and co-author of about 12 books. And now the one of my books is turned into the Making Gay History podcast, which we launched
Awesome.
5 years ago. And we've had 4.7 million episode downloads in 200 countries and territories around the world. And what we do is we bring LGBTQ history to life through the voices of the people who lived it.
Amazing. I love that.
Yeah.
What I love about this is that you must get the opportunity then to speak with so many different LGBTQ people, learn so many different stories, and able to have a certain type of perspective that I guess not many people are able to have, if they're not necessarily doing what you're doing. So,
Yes.
from all the different people that you've gotten to speak with and the different stories that you've gotten the opportunity to hear, how has that shaped even your own thoughts and outlook on LGBTQ history and what it means for today?
So I started my interviews in 1988 when I was commissioned to write an oral history book about what was then called the gay and lesbian civil rights movement.
Mhm.
So almost all of the interviews that we share in the Making Gay History podcast are drawn from that archive, which is more than 30 years
Mhm.
old. So when I was 30, I was getting to travel across the country and interview people who had been involved at the very start of the movement here in the US.
Yeah.
I knew nothing about the movement at the time. I
Yeah.
thought that everything began at the Stonewall Uprising in New York
Mhm.
City. But it turns out the first organization was founded in Los Angeles in 1950 by 5 gay guys, and it grew from there. And the oldest story that we share on the podcast dates back to 1919.
Wow,
Yeah.
wow. Touch on some of those pre-Stonewall stories, something that stood out to you,
Mhm.
something that's made an impact on you,
Yeah.
that kind of changed your perspective a little bit. Share some of those with us.
Sure. Talking to the old timers in particular gave me a sense
Mhm.
that I had ancestors, that there was a
Yeah.
history that came well before me, and that I stood on the shoulders of greats,
Mhm.
and that without their work, I could never have done what I did because they
Yeah.
changed the world. So one of the people I wanted to talk to was a man named Wendell Sayers, who
Mhm.
attended the 1959 convention of the Mattachine Society in
Mhm.
Denver, Colorado. The Mattachine Society was that first organization founded in 1950. And
Mhm.
Wendell was special in that he was African American.
Mhm.
There were very few people of color in the movement. There was almost no one in the movement. There may be a few hundred people at most in those early days. And Wendell risked his career. He was an attorney who worked for the state attorney general in Colorado in the 1950s and 60s. He was the first African American
Mhm.
lawyer to work for the state attorney general. And going to that convention, he put himself at risk because he was so visible. He was the one whose story dates back to 1919 when his father sent him and his mother from Western Kansas, where they lived, to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, because he thought Wendell was possibly homosexual and wanted him
Oh,
to be
wow.
properly diagnosed. So it was extraordinary hearing his story.
Diagnosed. Wow.
Yeah, so I learned about the courage these people had, and
Mhm.
although none of them spoke of courage, they always talked about anger and how anger drove them
Yeah.
because of something that happened to them or someone they loved, and also love drove people. People were looking for boyfriends and girlfriends, so they went to meetings of these organizations where they knew they could meet other gay and lesbian people.
Certainly. Wow. And I like that you brought that up because I remembered the first time I ever heard of William Dorsey Swan, who was born into slavery and was the first person in the United States to, lead a queer resistant group, call themselves a drag queen, all of that. And for years of, reading so many things about gay history, especially gay history in the United States, I never really came upon that before. And so I maybe learned about this maybe the past 7-8 years, so not that long. And that was very, very surprising for me. And I know for many people, especially if they listen to your podcast, getting those stories of pre-Stonewall days, opens up a whole lot more than, one could think of before. For you, what has the response been like with so many downloads? That response has been great, but what's the feedback been like from, hearing it from others?
Really, really positive. Just the whole range from parents of LGBTQ people who are grateful for the work that people did to help make the world possible for their children, to one of my favorites, a young woman. She was 15 when she wrote to me from Moscow. Not Moscow, Idaho, Moscow, Russia. She's a young lesbian, and she was so inspired by one of our episodes, the one that featured Vito Russo, who's a co-founder of ACT UP and GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, and the author of an important book called The Celluloid Closet, about how Hollywood's portrayal of homosexuals shaped how the public came to understand us, not in a good way. So she was so inspired by his episode, she asked if she could translate it into Russian, post it on her website so that her friends who didn't speak English, who were LGBTQ, could follow along and be inspired by Vito's story. So I've heard from people from everywhere, from South Africa to Russia to Libya. I heard from a kid in Libya.
That is really great. So on the podcast, have you been able to, talk with people from like other places that aren't like from America or in the West to kind of get, what it's like in those places and what gay history there is like, limited or emerging, or what that is like, and how has that been for you to kind of get to explore those stories?
Well, I've heard from people. I don't record new stories in general. So my stories are all old stories. But I had the chance last year to give a presentation at the US Embassy in Poland, in Warsaw, virtually, unfortunately, because of COVID, because there are all kinds of problems in Poland with anti-gay efforts. They have what are called LGBTQ-free areas, which is insane. What I find is that the stories around the world, and there are countries where it's just impossible for LGBTQ people, but there are also places that are not so different from how the US was 50 or 75 years ago. So in those places, I find that people who hear these stories look to the stories of American activists as an example of how they can accomplish the same things that we have accomplished here. So while we're comfortable here, or at least I'm comfortable here in Manhattan where I live, it's not necessarily the same for immigrant kids in Queens, for example. I went to speak at my old high school, which is most of the students are immigrant kids or kids of color from the surrounding Jamaica Queens community. And that's Jamaica Queens, not Jamaica, Jamaica.
Yeah, I'm Jamaica, but I know I'm Jamaica, but I have a grandmother that lives in Jamaica Queens.
So I spoke in my high school, and after I spoke, it was to the entire school, the hundreds of kids in the auditorium. A group of young women came up afterwards to speak with me, again, talking about their immigrant families and how, for the most part, they had to be closeted. And there was a small group of boys hanging back. And I said, "What's with the boys?" And the young woman said, "It's much more difficult for the boys than it is for the girls." And they wanted to overhear what we were talking about, but they were too afraid to talk with me. So that's 15 miles east of where I am sitting right now. So it doesn't have to be Poland.
Exactly. That is true.
It's right here at home.
Yeah, talk me through the naming the podcast. You didn't say telling gay history. You didn't say reporting gay history. You didn't say, you said making gay history. Why is that?
Well, that's the title of my book. And
There we go.
and and I say making gay history because these people made history.
Mm-hmm.
The original title of the book was Making History. It was published in 1992. And we didn't use the word gay in the title because we thought that the sales force at the publishing company would have trouble selling a book with the word gay in the title, and that bookstore owners would be uncomfortable showing the book face out. But when we did a second edition 10 years later, the world had changed so much already and very quickly that we added the word gay to it. So we recorded one of my favorite episodes with a group of LGBTQ elders at a retirement community in outside of Delaware, outside of Wilmington, Delaware, in the Pennsylvania countryside. And the reason we went was to interview Kay Lahusen, who was one of the champions of our movement from the 1960s and 70s. And Kay had retired and was living in this community and started a monthly gay table and a dinner table. So we went to have dinner with her friends. And one of the things I asked them when we were recording the interviews was, please complete the phrase, I made gay history when. As in, I made gay history when I did this or that. And the stories they told were absolutely incredible, even though they all started out by saying, well, I didn't do anything significant. But it turned out each of them had contributed in a really significant way during difficult times in this country for gay people.
Certainly. And, we talk a lot about gay history. And I think even today, gay history is still being made in different ways. And so for someone who's researched a lot of this, what are some of the things that you look on today where you see that gay history being made? And what are some things that you hope to see become created and become a part of gay history soon?
One of the sad things I see is this yet another round of backlash. Every time we take a step forward, there are people ready to take us down. And this happened in the late 1970s when an American singer named Anita Bryant led a campaign that she called Save Our Children. And the campaign was targeted at rolling back newly passed legislation in cities across the country that protected gay people from discrimination. That was the late 70s. Now here we are, year 2000, what year is this? 2022. And look what's happening in Florida with the Don't Say Texas. Gay bill and Texas and other places. The right wing has always used us as a wedge issue. They can't use plain old gay and lesbian people anymore because there's so many of us out and people know us that they can't demonize us in the way that they can trans kids, because most people don't know trans people in the way that they know gay and lesbian people. So that's something that makes me sad, is seeing this cycle repeated over and over again. What excites me and makes me very happy is to see the response of young LGBTQ people. I don't know if you've seen any of the walkouts from schools in Florida and the protests. And those kids are fierce. And they come from such a diverse range of gender identities and race and ethnicity. And so the movement has grown broader in time. So, in the earliest days, the people who were able to be out, and there weren't many, were people who were the most privileged within society, even though they were discriminated against. And now we see a much broader movement than when I was a young person, for example. So that encourages me. So when I first started out, just talking about, I did a column once that said gay people should be allowed to marry. It was outrageous. And now it's like, but I also always said I'd never live to see the day when gay people could get married.
That is true.
Here I
know. When I just moved to America, only a few states had it at the time. And I remembered I was like, maybe in around 10 to 15 years, all of them could finally do it. And baby happened in maybe like 1 to 2 years. And I was like, oh, wow, this, really, really came around quickly. So it's interesting to see something like that. At a certain point when you lived in a world, in a country, in a space, in a place where something did not seem possible. So it wasn't even something like on your mind to think about that was real. And when now it's reality, it's like, almost feels like it's so normal and regular. Like when I speak back to family at home and I will talk about just marriage, to me, that only just means, straight people get married. They've always done that for years.
Right.
People getting married to me now is just so normal in my head. And I will say that, but I'm talking to people in places where that's not even like a
No,
possibility. It's not even
no.
like a thought. And it's still something strange, still something alien, still
Yes.
something that has to be talked about deeply. When to me, it's just like, oh, that's like a normal, regular
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to see, that development. And I guess even so rapidly in a way. And so that is really, really great to see and really interesting.
I think what's been key is visibility.
Yes. Yes.
That until we were visible and visible enough, and people got to know us, it wasn't possible for change. And there were two key turning points. One was the post-Stonewall era, and then of course the AIDS crisis, because hundreds of thousands of people were forced out of the closet because they were sick.
Yep.
And people got to know us and to see our community and our various communities and how we took care of each other. And that changed hearts and minds.
Certainly. So you've written 12 books. What? So that's a lot. That's a lot of writing.
It's a lot of books.
That's a lot of books. That's a lot of books. What do you like exploring when you're like, okay, I'm gonna go and write a new book? What is usually the thing that sparks that, thing in your brain to say, I want to put this to paper. This is what I want to explore. This is what I want to research. This is the story that I'm trying to tell. This is what the narrative I'm trying to give to people. What usually sparks that?
Two things. One is basic interest, so that I had, and especially in the LGBTQ space, I had things that I wanted to say. I did a book on suicide loss that was prompted by the fact my father killed himself when I was a child.
Wow.
So some of my books were prompted by the fact I had a mortgage to pay. And I knew how to write, and there were stories that needed to be told that weren't my own. I've co-authored 5 sports autobiographies.
Oh.
Ask me how interested I am in sports.
How interested are you in sports?
Now I know a lot now about figure skating, soccer. What are the other ones I did? Olympic diving, bodybuilding.
Well, those are pretty gay.
They're pretty gay. Yes, they're the softer sports. Actually, there's a football player who wants me to write his autobiography.
Oh.
And I said, I have to draw the line somewhere.
Yes. A line has to be drawn somewhere.
I said no. I just,
Yeah. I love that. I love that.
I just knew I couldn't relate to that experience. So I find that what interests me most in terms of my own work, my own writing, and I'm done writing books. I love podcasts now. Things that are of personal interest to me. So LGBTQ issues. I also produce a podcast. I co-produce a podcast about the Holocaust. I learned to turn off all my phones and all the devices, except today. I forgot. Sorry about that noise. I co-produce a podcast called Those Who Are There, Voices from the Holocaust. I'm Jewish. I grew up in a neighborhood filled with Holocaust survivors in Queens, New York. And so the subject really interested me. When I was approached about doing a podcast about that, I wanted to do it. That also draws on recorded testimonies.
So
I like topics that I have a personal attachment to.
Yeah. I love that. Well, the podcast, you've been really, really enjoying doing it and having it to be out there with so many recordings and so many things from the past. Do you just have like this great big archive that you're able to just delve into and create these podcast episodes? What does it look like typically bringing an episode together?
So I have more than 100 more than 100 interviews in my own archive.
Yeah.
We sometimes go beyond my archive to interview people who we need to fill in pieces. So for example, we have a season coming up in the fall called Coming of Age During the 1970s, which will be covering that period after Stonewall and before AIDS, during a time when I was growing up from age 12 to 22.
Yeah.
So it'll be cast, the movement story will be cast against the background of my own growing up. But I obviously was not involved in the movement when I was 12. So that'll take a back seat. We'll be digging into a lot of other archives to dig up old tape that other people have recorded. So it's not just my archive. We have the opportunity to explore archives all across the country. And we have a fierce researcher who once found just this extraordinary recording, the one of a kind that had never been heard before, hiding in the basement of the Lesbian Her Story archives here in New York, here in Brooklyn, New York. And it was simply marked Star or Star House. And it turned out to be a 1970 interview with Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, two of the trans icons of our movement.
Oh my God.
It was one of those reel-to-reel tapes, one of those round reel-to-reels.
Yes.
And he said he was terrified taking it to have it digitized in case something happened to it. And it was a 1970 interview that no one had ever heard. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. No, that is a gem. That is a great find. That is really a gem. I think maybe the first or second time I ever visited Fire Island, I saw this book. And it explored the lives of, and with pictures and everything, of gay men in the 70s, you know, post Stonewall, pre-AIDS crisis. And that was so astounding to me. You know, there's not many things out there that really delve into that. And especially that very specific time period, and seeing that and reading that book and seeing all those photos was just such just great to dive into such a mind. It was so great.
I was there.
Yes. Oh, you said you were there. Exactly.
I was there. So in fact, one of my first Fire Island story will be in the upcoming season of the podcast. I was 16, didn't know where I was going, and I was taken by a neighbor who was the Reverend Frank Mullen, who I thought would marry my mother. He was a widower, but he was not so interested in my mother.
No, that's a great story. That's a great story to explore. I love that. Well, listen, Eric, it's been such a pleasure getting to talk with you today. How can people, you know, pick up your books? How can they listen to the podcast? How can they follow you and keep up with whatever you're doing and what's coming up next?
So people can follow us on our website at makinggayhistory.com. They can find me at Eric B. Marcus on Twitter, or you can find us at Making Gay History on Twitter. Also, we're on Facebook, Making Gay History, and on Instagram at Making Gay History Podcast.
Awesome.
So there we are. Yes, we are everywhere.
Beautiful. And so to everyone who's watching, by the way, the links will be in the description below, so you can go ahead and check out everything that Eric has to offer. Check out Making Gay History. All of that will be in the description below.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on your show today.
Of course, it has been such a pleasure. I had a great time getting to chat, having a great kiki, and I hope that we are able to do this again in the future. So thank you so much for being here. Such a pleasure.
Thanks. Take care.
Take care. To those watching, please follow Team Racine Productions at Team Racine on social media. Like, comment, and subscribe. And most of all, thank you for watching. Bye, everyone.